Continuing on with our notes from Module 2-2, percent greater than 100% and less than 1%. This will pick up on page 88 in our book, page 88. Learn percents less than 1%. Percents can also be less than 1%. Consider the following situation. The distance from the center of the Earth to the surface is also known as the radius of the Earth. The radius of the Earth is about 4,000 miles. The radius of the Sun is about 430,000 miles. The ratio of the Earth's radius to the Sun's radius is 4,000 to 430,000. You can use equivalent ratios to show that the radius of the Earth is about 93 hundredths of a percent of the Sun's radius. This is a hundredths. That means it's less than 1. Because 430,000 divided by 4,300 is 100, divide 4,000 by 4,300 and round to the nearest hundred. So we're taking and looking at the ratio 4,000 to 430,000. We are dividing both by 4,300, 4,300, and we have an approximate percent of 93 hundredths to 100, which makes it a percent. Percents are less than 1% when the number being compared to 100 is less than 1. When the percent is less than 1, the part is significantly less than the whole. The radius of the Earth is significantly less than the radius of the Sun. Continuing on. On a 10 by 10 grid, 93 hundredths of a percent is represented by shading 93% of one grid square. One grid square represents 1%, and 93 hundredths of a percent is less than 1%. Compared to 100%, 93 hundredths percent is significantly less. Here's the example. So 93 hundredths means 93 hundredths per 100, so less than 1 per 100. And you can see the different types of ratios. 93 hundredths to 100, 93 hundredths to 100, or 93 hundredths over 100. 93 hundredths, we have the THS to make it decimals of a percent. And what they mean up here is they're saying, okay, we have one tiny little square, which is 1%, but 93 hundredths is even smaller than that. And you can see that they put another picture to set it out and say 93 of these smaller tiny little squares inside of a tiny square would be 93 hundredths. When thinking about the size of the Earth compares to the size of the Sun, it makes sense that the Earth's radius is significantly less than the Sun's radius. Earth's radius is less than 1% of the Sun's radius. On the side of page 88, talk about it. A classmate used a 10 by 10 grid to model 93 hundredths as shown. What mistake did they make? How does 93 hundredths compare to 93%? What mistake did they make? If we're comparing it to 93 hundredths and 93%, the mistake that they made, if they're trying to show the 93 hundredths, they would need to show a very small amount over in one small section, because 93 hundredths is less than 1%. This small square shows only 1%. This picture here that they created shows 93%. So the picture shows 93%. 93 hundredths of a percent would be part of only one small square in a 10 by 10 square. Or 10 by 10 grid. Continuing on to page 89 in your book. Example 3. Identify the percent. What percent is represented by the 10 by 10 grid? So remember, we have a 10 by 10 grid, but this is one part of one of those tiny little squares. So we would need to look over here. We would count it the same way as we did for the regular 10 by 10 square. It's just that we would need to remember to put the decimal in the final answer. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. The percent compares the number of shaded squares to 100 because one whole grid contains 100 squares. This 10 by 10 grid is 100 squares. What they're asking us to identify is only part of one of those 100 squares. Less than one grid square is shaded on the 10 by 10 grid. The close-up reveals that 1/4, or 25 hundredths of one grid square is shaded. And remember, I counted these up and I counted up 25 of the very small squares were shaded. Write a ratio that compares the total number of shaded squares to the whole grid of 100 squares. So the ratio would be 25 hundredths to 100, 25 hundredths to 100, or 25 hundredths over 100. So the percent represented by the 10 by 10 square is 25 hundredths percent. Another way to write this percent would be 1/4 percent. Here's our check. Page 89 still. What percent is represented by the 10 by 10 grid? So we have a 10 by 10 grid. This smaller part is within a 1% square. So we would count up 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. So if I'm taking a look at this, we have 0.70%. So 70 hundredths of a percent. Or another way to say that would be 7/10 percent. We can drop the 0 and say 7/10 percent. We can also represent it by 7/10%. Continuing on with page 90. We're on page 90. Model 4. Example 4, model the percent. Model the percent. The diet of a jellyfish consists primarily of plankton, which are tiny organisms living in the ocean. One species of plankton has an average length of 4/100 of an inch. Suppose a certain jellyfish has a length of 8 inches. Write a percent that compares the length of the plankton to the length of the jellyfish. Then use a 10 by 10 grid to model the percent. Step 1. Write a ratio comparing 4/100 of an inch to 8 inches. Use equivalent ratios to show that the plankton's length is blank of the length of the jellyfish. So what we would do is we would use and write uh, the ratio here, 4/100 to 8. And then we would take a look and we would say that we would need to divide 100 by 8 to get the 12 and a half. And then we would say 8 times 12 and a half equals 100. And to write in equivalent ratios, we would do the same thing up to the 4/100. 4/100 times 12 and a half would give us 1/2 over 100. So to answer this up here, to fill in this blank, the equivalent ratio would be 1/2 or 5/10 a percent. And how would that look? Well, step 2, shade the 10 by 10 grid to model the 5/10 percent. Shade half of 1% by shading half of one of the grid. So I'm going to go over here. This is less than 1. So I'm going to go down to this one corner and I'm going to go ahead and just shade it in. And this represents half of a percent because it's half of 1% of this 10 by 10 grid.